Dear guests, welcome to today's seminar titled The Curse of Empire, Russia's Tradition of Domination over Ukraine and Poland, and Germany's Share in it. First, a small technical announcement. The seminar today will last about 1.5 hours. At the end, there will be a Q&A section where questions from the audience will be discussed. Therefore, if you have questions for our panelists, please write them down to the chat during the seminar. They will be read out at the end. As always, the seminar is being recorded and will be later published on the YouTube channel, the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. I will post the link to the channel and our partner institutions into the chat after the announcement. The languages of the webinar are English and Ukrainian. We have a simultaneous translation going. If you want to hear the translation, please click on the icon with the globe at the right bottom of the screen. Thank you for your patience, and now I pass the word on to Guido Hausmann.
Yeah, thank you very much, Georgi. Welcome to everybody. From my side, my name is Guido Hausmann. I'm the co-speaker of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. I'm professor of history of Eastern Europe here at the University of Regensburg. Welcome to this webinar, which is organized by the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission in cooperation with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of Edmonton, KIUS, and with Ukraina Moderna, the journal Ukraina Moderna, and which is funded by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung here in Germany. Thank you very much. So we have a webinar with the title The Curse of Empire, Russia's Tradition of Domination over Ukraine and Germany's Share in it. And we are doing this webinar basically because we have this recent publication by our colleague Martin Schulze Wessel. In Germany, it's called a book which is entitled Der Fluch des Imperiums, die Ukraine, Polen und der Irrweg in der russischen Geschichte. And there are lots of topics related to this book, and we are organizing it as a kind of a presentation of the book and of a discussion of this book. And for this purpose, we are happy to have 3 participants or 3 speakers. First of all, of course, the author of the book, Martin Schulze Wessel, then Polina Barvinska, from kind of giving us the Ukrainian perspective, and then Frank Sysyn giving us a Canadian-Ukrainian perspective. I will briefly introduce our 3 speakers. First of all, the author of the book and speaker today, Martin Schulze Wessel. Martin has studied history in Slavic literatures and languages in Munich, in Moscow, and in Berlin. He was a junior researcher, so to say, at the Friedrich-Meinecke Institute of the Free University Berlin from 1990 to 1995. Then also a researcher, junior researcher at the Institute of History at the University of Halle-Wittenberg in the years 1996 to 2002. And then since 2003, he holds the chair of the history of Eastern Europe at the LMU, the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. He was, among other functions, and he has many functions in his career. He was head of the Association of Historians of Germany in the years 2012 and until 2016. He was also co-speaker of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission, actually a founder of this commission in the years 2015 to 2022. He's also the co-speaker of the graduate school of East and Southeast European Studies at München and Regensburg. He is also the director of the Munich-based Collegium Carolinum, the editor and co-editor of important journals as the Bohemia, the Jahrbücher für Geschichte Osteuropas, the journal Geschichte und Gesellschaft. And just would like to mention one further kind of, not commitment, but important step in his career probably is that he was in 2021-22 Richard von Weizsäcker visiting fellow at the St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. There would be more to say, but I leave it for the moment with this. I just want to point to some major publications of Martin, which is his published dissertations, Russlands Blick auf Preußen, die polnische Frage in der Diplomatie und politischen Öffentlichkeit des Zarenreiches und der Sowjetunion 1697 bis 1947. So the Polish, so-called Polish question in the diplomacy and public of the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet state from the late 17th century to the time after World War II, published in 1995. Second book is Revolution und religiöser Dissens, der römisch-katholische und russisch-orthodoxe Klerus als Träger religiösen Wandels in den römischen Ländern und in Russland, 1848 bis 1922. This is about revolution and religious dissent, Roman Catholic and Russian Orthodox clerics or clerus as barriers of religious change in the Bohemian countries, lands in the Bohemian lands, and in Russia in the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, published in 2011. Then there is a book he has published in 2018 on the Prague Spring. And then the latest book publication by Martin is the book we will present and discuss today. So The Curse of Empire. So he will, at the beginning, will introduce the topic of his book, and then we will have two speakers who will discuss his presentation or his book. And one is, as I mentioned, is Polina Barvinska, and I also will briefly introduce her. Polina Barvinska has a PhD from the National Mechnikov University of Odessa in 2001. The topic of the dissertation is Ukrainian-German relations 1917 to 1922, and she has a habilitation in 2013 on East European studies in the German-speaking countries, and she is since then a professor at the chair of world history in Odessa, but has since last year she is a visiting scholar at the Leibniz Institute of East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg, and works in a project on Ukrainian statehood, Germany and Russia 1918 and its consequences, a project, research project, which is funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung. Polina is also a member of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission. She's also a member of the Austrian Ukrainian Historical Commission, and she is a member of the editorial board also of the German Jahrbücher für Geschichte Osteuropa. I just would like to point to one of her major publications, which is her book published in Ukrainian in Between Science and Politics, Interpretations of Eastern Europe in the Academic Environment of the German-Speaking Area in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then we have as a third speaker, Frank Sysyn from Canada, from Toronto. Frank Sysyn is director of the Peter Jacek Center for Ukrainian Historical Research Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. He's a professor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religious Studies at the University of Alberta, and he is editor-in-chief of the Ruszewski Translation Project, so the English translation of the multi-volume history of Ukraine Rus. He's also the head of the executive committee of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at CEUS. He's a member of the editorial board of Harvard Ukrainian Studies and the journal East-West, a journal of Ukrainian Studies. And he has taught at the University of Alberta, at Harvard University, at Columbia University, Stanford University, and other institutions. I also would like here to point just to a few publications of Frank, in particular to the book Between Poland and the Ukraine, The Dilemma of Adam Kisiel, 1600 to 1653, published in 1985, and to Mikhail Ruszewski, historian at National Awakener, published in 2001. He has done a lot of research on the Khmelnytsky uprising and lots of publications on this topic, as well as on Ukrainian historiography, on early modern Ukrainian political culture, but also on modern Ukrainian religious history and on the Holodomor. And I leave it with this for the moment. I think we have a wonderful kind of number of 3 speakers in today's webinar, and I would like to hand over to Martin now to start with his introduction or his presentation on his book. Please, Martin.
Yeah. Thank you, Guido, for this generous introduction. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present my book to you and to discuss it with the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission and with the wider public. Unfortunately, I have a cold, so my voice is a little bit has a problem. But most of Ukrainian listeners will listen to the interpreter, so it will not be a big problem for you. So a few words about the aim of my book. The aim is to show that Russia's war against Ukraine is based on deep historical and cultural roots in Russia. Therefore, the war is not Putin's war, but Russia's war. The book has a political message. A lasting peace is not possible through a deal with Putin, as Trump and maybe some German politicians think, but only if Russia overcomes its imperial legacy. At present, Ukraine is defending the freedom and security of Europe against the Russian hegemonic power, which operates from a profound historical tradition. As a result, the West has an obligation and a vested interest to provide Ukraine with full military support and to integrate Ukraine into NATO as soon as possible. So this is the book. The book draws a parallel between the Polish and the Ukrainian questions in Russian politics since the 18th century. In my lecture of about 20 minutes, I will not try to summarize the whole content of the book. Instead, I will focus on 3 central concepts: the epoch, continuities, and contingencies in Russia's imperial policy towards Ukraine and Poland. First, on the question of the era. Zeitenwende, that means turning point in history, is probably the most used term in German political discourse since 2022. It asserts that an epoch has ended and a new epoch has begun. In fact, Russian policy is rather a continuation and a radicalization of a traditional imperial policy Russia pursued before. A sharp caesura, however, exists in the Western and especially in the German perception of Russia. The Zeitenwende means the farewell to certain German illusions. The epochal framework in which Putin operates is the age of the modern Russian Empire, that is the period since the 18th century. Putin refers to this period of the Tsarist Empire in his speeches and in his self-performances much more than to the Soviet Union. The imperial splendor of the Tsarist Empire seems more attractive than the Soviet Union, whose economic problems are still conscious today. But it is not only the politics of history that Putin connects with Peter I. I'm primarily concerned with structural continuities since the early 18th century. We in the West associate Peter above all with Russia's opening up to Europe. In Germany and in Western Europe, less attention is paid to the power policy that Peter pursued in East Central Europe. Poland and Ukraine were independent states until the end of the 17th century, and then fell under direct or hegemonic rule of Russia in the time of Peter I. This period also saw the emergence of the first East-West conflict in modern European history as a result of a Nordic war between Russia and Sweden. From the Russian perspective, the war of aggression against Sweden was also about trade policy objectives. Russia exported shipbuilding materials such as timber to Western European powers, especially to England. As long as Russia had no access to the Baltic Sea, Sweden taxed Russian exports. At the end of the Nordic War, Russia had gained hegemony over almost the entire Baltic Sea area. But Russian goals went beyond that. Together with German territorial states such as Mecklenburg and Holstein, the Tsar planned the construction of canals between the Baltic and the Northern Sea, which would allow Russia to bring its exports directly without Danish custom duties to English customers. In Peter's time, the imperial policy over Poland and Ukraine, the export of raw materials, the planning of infrastructures, and the cooperation with German states were directly related. This connection corresponded exactly to the Kremlin's Nord Stream policy, which was also aimed at building an imperial infrastructure to dominate East Central Europe and to establish a special partnership with Germany. This challenged Western politics then and now. London, the British Empire, planned to push Russia back from the Baltic Sea. The British government formed an alliance with Sweden and Poland to achieve this. For England, everything depended on the cooperation with Prussia, a small but highly armed state at that time. For the first time, Prussia found itself in a middle position between West and East. After long hesitation, the Prussian king, Frederick William, decided against England and in favor of an alliance with Peter I. The decisive factor were his anti-Polish interest to exercise hegemonic control over his neighbor Poland together with Russia. The real meaning of Zeitenwende is that Germany has overcome this ambivalence between Russia and the West, and this only in 2022, I think. In the time of Peter I, there are the following patterns of this epoch of modern Russian history became clear. It was the Russian rule or the hegemony over Poland and Ukraine. It was the special relationship between Russia and Berlin, and it was the eminent role of imperial infrastructures. Let us now talk about the curse, that is, continuities and path dependencies. What creates long-lasting continuities in international politics? My thesis is that the logics that defined Russian politics towards Ukraine since the 19th century were prefigured by Russian policy towards Poland since the 18th century. Russian policy towards Poland was not determined, but it was characterized by a high degree of consistency. In the beginning, there was the Russian interest in controlling Poland. In a certain situation at the end of the 18th century, this turned into an interest in the partition of Poland, together with Prussia and the Habsburg monarchy. The partitions changed the character of Russian-Prussian relations. In the 19th century, the alliance to control Poland, which was characteristic for the 18th century, became an alliance to maintain the partition of Poland against the national and democratic aspirations of Polish society expressed in the uprisings of 1797, 1830, 1831, 1846 and 47, and 1863. In this constellation, the power political antagonism between Russia and the West, as it had already formed in the 18th century, became an ideological antagonism of the 19th century, which continued to have an effect in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the 19th century, Russian politics began to see the Ukrainian questions to the Russian lens. Although the Russian national movement was still small in the 1860s, Russian politicians and journalists saw it as a huge danger. They feared that Russia could not cope with the Ukrainian national movement, just as it could not cope with the Polish one. Typical is one essay that the conservative journalist, the Russian conservative journalist Mikhail Katkov, wrote in 1863 about the coincidence of Ukrainophile and Polish interests. I quote, "Ukraine has never had its own history. It has never been an independent state. Ukrainians are authentic Russian people, indigenous Russian people, essential part of Russian people, without which it can hardly remain what it is today." The similarity to Putin's Ukraine discourse is striking. I will try to summarize the continuity there's one other feature. This is the feature of culture, which became important and formative in the year of 1830-31, when the first big Polish uprising emerged, which challenged the Russian Empire fundamentally. And at that time, Alexander Pushkin, the national poet of Russia, wrote a political poem which was directed not so much against the Poles, but against the Western liberal public. And he stated that the conflict between Russia and Poland is a domestic affair, an affair which is not, in which the Europeans should not intervene. And a second point he made was that he formulated a sharp alternative between two developments. He said that the main question of the uprising is whether the rivers of Slavonic people will end in the Russian Sea, or whether the Russian Sea will dry out. This is the crucial question, he said. And of course, this is a highly ideological question, which states an untrue alternative. There are many possibilities between these two alternatives. For example, the existence of two states, of a Russian state and a Polish state as neighbors, or the idea of Polish autonomy as a part of a Russian state. And this all or nothing is a typical form of interpreting Russian Polish relations, which became typical for the interpretation of Russian-Ukrainian relations as well. So I try to summarize the continuity in Russian East Central European politics is based, first of all, in the logics of politics. Since the beginning of the 18th century, Russia's imperial policy towards Poland and Ukraine has placed it in opposition to national and democratic movements of both countries and to the liberal sphere of the West in the 19th century. This was not determined, but it was logical. In this process, cultural patterns emerged, such as Pushkin's interpretation, which developed their own continuity as stereotypes. Both imperial politics and imperial stereotypes supported each other and formed a system. The phenomenon of great permanence in Russian policy towards Poland and Ukraine can be traced back to this. So, were there any chances of new beginnings in the tradition of Russian policy towards Poland and Ukraine? Whenever one talks about structures and traditions, one must also consider the possibility of unexpected events that explode traditions and structures. In the long tradition of Russian imperial policy in East Central Europe, there were indeed such unexpected events that promised a new beginning. I will briefly recount three stories. The first story is fairy tale-like. And you will remember it when you have forgotten all the lecture. In 1732, a Russian envoy on his way back from Hungary to Petersburg came to a small Ukrainian town called Leshno, and in the church service he noticed the beautiful voice of a boy from the church choir. The boy Alexei, who worked as a shepherd, was taken by the envoy to the imperial court in St. Petersburg and henceforth sang in the court there. Peter's I's daughter, Elizabeth, not only liked Alexei's voice, but became her lover and He became her lover and rose to the position of a court-martial at her side. Even in his new position, he did not forget his homeland and promoted Ukraine to the empress. Elisabetta Petrovna was the first Tsarina to travel to Ukraine and was enthusiastically received by the Ukrainian noblemen, by the Starshina. She fulfilled the expectations of the Ukrainians by dissolving the state authority and making it possible for the former capital of the Hetmanate of Baturin to experience a cultural and political Indian summer. Despite this promising beginning, the story did not become a turning point in Russian-Ukrainian politics. Structures proved stronger than the unexpected fairy tale event. The effectiveness of structures unfolded, for example, in the area of customs. It was during the time of Elisabetta Petrovna that Ukraine was integrated into Russia's customs area, which of course had long-term effects. The state administration apparently remained unaffected by the Tsarina's pro-Ukrainian policy. Another unexpected event for Russian imperial politics was related to the accession of Alexander I to the throne. The grandson of Catherine II hated her style of politics and considered the partitions of Poland a crime. He appointed his friend Adam Czartoryski, the son of a Polish-Lithuanian noble family, as foreign minister, a Pole at the head of Russian foreign policy. This story had also fairy tale features. In fact, Czartoryski planned a principal reorientation of Russian policy. His aim was to restore Poland and to end the close alliance with Prussia. The Napoleonic Wars prevented Czartoryski from implementing his policy, and after the wars, the majority of Russian diplomats, and as well as the Tsar, reverted to the patterns of traditional foreign policy. At the Congress of Vienna, Alexander I agreed to the creation of a Polish state linked to Russia by personal union, but at the same time, the Russian-Prussian-Austrian alliance was restored with the Holy Alliance. In the 1860s, many Russian politicians were convinced of the harmfulness of a Russian-Prussian alliance, which prevented them from forming alliances with Western European states, first of all with France. Chancellor Gorchakov realized that Russia could only pursue a sovereign foreign policy in Europe if it reconciled with Poland and ended its special relations with Prussia. It was the evil genius of Otto von Bismarck that prevented this. Already as a Prussian ambassador in Petersburg and later as a prime minister in Berlin, he alerted conservative politicians in Russia to the revolutionary dangers threatening from Poland and France. When an uprising broke out in Poland in 1863, he had won. Russian politics returned to the old track of imperial policy. Of course, 1917 and then the founding of the Soviet Union in 1922 seems to be the deepest break in the tradition of Russian politics. But there are voices that interpret the Russian Revolution as Tocqueville interpreted the French Revolution, that it actually served to preserve the empire and gave it a new revolutionary legitimacy. However, I would interpret the nationalities policy of the early 20s as an actual attempt of a new beginning. Lenin recognized that the great Russian chauvinism, especially towards Ukraine, was a mortgage to the revolution that made it impossible to spread the ideology of socialism in the imperial peripheries. In the Stalin era, however, the great Russian patterns of thought returned to Soviet politics. The Holodomor was decisive for this. Stalin regarded the protest against forced collectivization and the catastrophic supply situation in Ukraine as a national form of resistance controlled by Poland and ultimately by the West. The interpretation pattern goes back to Pushkin, who saw the Poles or Ukrainians as an extension of the West. The genocide of the Ukrainian people in the Holodomor was closely linked to the restoration of the Russian imperial legacy. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you, Martin. So wonderful introduction or into your book with the three kind of main points on the epoch, and then the course or continuities, and then the question of contingencies, and highlighting the how you call it, the interpretation patterns, I think, which is very important. So we are very happy to have two wonderful discussions with us, and I have already introduced them, Polina Barvinska and Frank Sysyn. And I would hand over now the word to Polina Barvinska to start with commenting the book or the kind of the presentation by Martin. Please, Polina, go ahead.
Дуже дякую за чудове представлення, дякую за запрошення організаторам. А Мартіну Шульце Веселю я дякую за те, що написав таку важливу книжку, яку ми сьогодні обговорюємо, і, звісно, за те, що мені подарував її, і я мала можливість насолодитися її читанням. Свій короткий коментар я розпочну з далекого 1906 року, коли Михайло Грушевський власним коштом видав німецькою мовою перший том своєї знаменитої праці «Історія України Руси». В передмові він відзначав, що попри важливість історії українського народу для розуміння низки процесів у Європі і насамперед її східній частині, в західній історіографії з часів Енгеля, це кінець XVIII століття, не було узагальнюючих праць з історії України. Водночас я хочу зауважити, що то був час становлення в Німеччині східноєвропейської історії як фахової дисципліни. Тобто закладався, так би мовити, фундамент її. І тогочасні німецькі дослідники Східної Європи, хоча й відгукнулися рецензіями на працю Грушевського і поблажливо в яких визнали право українського народу на історію, тим не менш вони не включили її до кола своїх наукових інтересів, сконцентрувавшись на історії Росії. І оця тенденція, вона в німецькій історіографії зберігалася практично до 90-х років ХХ століття. Час від часу концепцію Грушевського згадували в німецькій історіографії, але зазвичай з епітетом «не безпроблемна». Українська тематика впродовж ХХ століття, вона переважно інструменталізувалася в німецькій історіографії і публіцистиці в часі Першої і Другої світової війни. Звісно, за час незалежності України німецька історіографія зробила доволі вагомий крок в вивченні української тематики. Я не хочу тут називати окремі праці, окремих авторів, брак часу і нікого не хочу образити. З'явилися роботи про українсько-російські відносини, про українсько-німецькі відносини, про українсько-польські відносини, окремі аспекти української історії. І от виникає питання, що ж, на мою думку, вирізняє книгу Мартіна Шульце Веселя з-поміж уже існуючих робіт. Це те, що він розглядає український чинник в доволі широкому контексті історії взаємин у Східній і Центрально-Східній Європі. Тобто він свого роду дає відповідь на ту заувагу, яку зробив Грушевський на початку ХХ століття. І це розглядається також у взаємозв'язку з німецькою східною політикою. Від 17 століття до сьогодення показана ця еволюція і важливість українського чинника. Тож особисто для мене книга не тільки про утиски Росії щодо України, але й важливість саме української тематики в історії як Центральної Європи, так Східної Європи і в окремих моментах взагалі Європи. Вже, наприклад, в першому розділі, аналізуючи шлях Москви до Європи, Мартін Шульце Весель відзначає, що панування над Україною було частково передумовою, а частково метою шляху Москви до Європи. І на початку цього шляху був насамперед поділ України. Український чинник відігравав важливу роль в становленні Російської імперії і залишався впродовж століть, як ми вже бачили, запорукою її імперської життєздатності. В книзі дуже добре показано, як підкорення і приєднання українських земель стало тим ресурсом, який сприяв домінуванню Росії в Східній Європі, становленню її як великої європейської держави і впливу в східноєвропейському регіоні. Він наголошує також на тому, що перемога в Полтавській битві стала засновницьким мітом російської імперської ідентичності. А приєднання Півдня і Причорномор'я Катериною II, воно доповнило цей міт про імперську велич Росії, яка зберігається і понині в російській пам'яті, на що він дуже добре наголошує. Водночас, як видно з книжки, і як це прочитала я, ми можемо побачити, що українське питання було важливим не тільки в становленні і зміцненні Російської імперії, а й важливим в історії польської державності. Наприклад, серед причин щодо прийняття рішення вчинити поділи Польщі Катериною II, це виокремлюється протистояння православних українців з католиками в Речі Посполитій. Потрібно сказати, що володіння Україною як запорукою існування імперії впродовж 19 століття також вважалося найбільш вагомим таким основою цієї імперської величі, і збереження цієї імперської величі, збереження цих ресурсів для процвітання. І ми вже бачили з презентації Мартіна Шульце Веселя цитату Каткова, що як результат цього страху перед українським рухом стало те, що взагалі українці заперечувалися як окремий народ, заперечувалося існування української мови і таке інше. Але не тільки царському режиму було властивий оцей страх перед втратою України. Це було притаманне і ліберально-демократичному тимчасовому уряду, який декларував право нації на самовизначення, так само, як і більшовицький уряд це декларував право на самовизначення, але водночас робив все для того, щоб залишити Україну в сфері свого впливу. Також цікавий для мене сюжет, пов'язаний з Денікіном, де Мартін Шульце Весель вказує, що, очевидно, його ігнорування права українців на якусь автономію, на самовизначення стало найбільш вагомою причиною того, що він зазнав поразки в боротьбі з більшовиками. Ну і, власне, радянська влада, як уже говорив сам Шульце Весель, намагалася утримувати українців в покорі, і одною з таких найбільш жорстоких форм утримання в цій покорі став Голодомор. Цій трагедії виділено спеціальний підрозділ, і дуже мені імпонує і показано те, що, як уже сказав Мартін Шульце Весель сам, що це було пов'язано не тільки там з колективізацією і якимись економічними інтересами, але як продовження цієї політики боротьби з українським національним рухом, Шульце Весель показує ті репресії, які були вчинені проти українських еліт. Ну і, власне, я хочу сказати, що ця книжка – це дійсно книжка і про сьогодення, як уже було сказано, і це намагання дати відповідь, чому ця війна сталася, і переконати і деконструювати дуже такі поширені тези, що це війна Путіна, а не російського народу, але, як показує книжка, це дійсно війна російського народу. І, власне, оце інфікування цією імперською величчю, воно притаманне і в тому числі російським лібералам було тривалий час і до певної міри залишається. Звісно, я хочу сказати, що книжка читається дуже легко, дуже добре. В книжці є чимало цікавих ілюстрацій, це карикатури, які викликають посмішку і які дають дуже таке добре розуміння окремих сюжетів, це чудові карти, тобто це приносить насолоду для читання. І водночас, безумовно, як і в кожній книжці, є сильніші розділи, є трошки слабші, є якісь фактологічні або інтерпретації, які викликають особисто в мене дискусію, але про це я, очевидно, напишу в я вже написала, по суті, в рецензії, це буде опубліковано. До певної міри я б хотіла звернутися, і це, можливо, мій професійний інтерес. Мені б, оскільки це книжка і про німецький чинник, мені б трошки більше хотілося б в розділі революції побачити оцей чотирикутник Німеччина, Польща, Росія, Україна, і щоб все-таки на ньому було більше акцентовано уваги. Водночас Шульце Весель багато пише про переслідування поляків в Радянському Союзі, оскільки в них вбачалося своєрідних інспіраторів українського руху. Я розумію, що німецьким історикам притаманно і німцям притаманно говорити про їх відповідальність, про їх причетність до якихось злочинів і так далі. Але я б все-таки теж хотіла б, щоб у цій книжці був і такий момент, і, можливо, говорили, що і німецький чинник в Радянському Союзі теж мав велике значення. Якщо ми подивимося на ті процеси, які відбувалися, то одним із перших процесів ще до тих репресій 30-х років це була шахтинська справа. Вона територіально була пов'язана з Україною, але була пов'язана з німецькими фахівцями. Також, якщо ми подивимося на справу спілки визволення України, то там членам цієї спілки інкримінувався не тільки зв'язок з поляками, а зв'язок і з Німеччиною. Тобто можна говорити про різний вплив німецького чинника і більш так ширше. Ну і на закінчення я б хотіла перейти до свого запитання. В передмові Шульце Весель справедливо відзначає те, що Німеччина попрощалася не тільки з своїм націонал-соціалістичним минулим, а також попрощалася з своїм імперським минулим. І це дійсно так, і можна сказати, що це прощання з імперським минулим, воно продовжується навіть тепер, тому що, наприклад, в МЗС Німеччини залу Бісмарка перейменовано там залу Європейської єдності, міністерка закордонних справ Анна-Лена Бербок, коли отримувала орден, відомий орден в Аахені, орден проти тваринної серйозності, це одна з найвідоміших нагород карнавалу, вона жартівливо заявила, що в нашій їдальні Міністерства закордонних справ більше не подають оселедець Бісмарка, а подають аахенське печиво, як таку своєрідну. Але водночас в цій же передмові Мартін Шульце Весель пише про те, що з початком війни почали вдаватися до старих кліше і часто порівнювати Путіна з Іваном Грозним. Оминаючи оцей імперський дискурс, Мартін Шульце Весель наголошує на тому, що не варто робити ці порівняння, не варто вдаватися до цих аналогій, а варто шукати витоки цієї агресії, власне, в імперському минулому. Тобто він акцентує увагу на те, що в Німеччині дуже багато є тих, хто не розуміє, якби, отої злочинної ідеології, яка була закладена, і руйнівної ідеології, яка була закладена, власне, в імперський період, в Російській імперії. І я хочу сказати про один випадок, з яким я зіткнулася, і який показує, що в німецькому суспільстві до цього часу нема оцього усвідомлення, і мені видається, що існує певна романтизація російського імперського минулого в німецькому суспільстві. Я не хочу називати той торговий центр і не хочу називати місто, але це йдеться про одне і те ж саме місце. Навесні 22-го року велика вітрина цього торгівельного закладу була прикрашена українськими товарами в українській символіці, і було оголошення, що значна там частина виручки від продажу цих товарів йде на підтримку України. Буквально через рік, уже навесні цього 23-го року, в цій вітрині для продажу були виставлені яйця Фаберже. І до них була прикріплена табличка, що це улюблений сувенір російських царів. Я більш чим переконана в тому, що люди з цієї торгового закладу, вони надалі проти війни Путіна, вони засуджують її агресію, але вони дуже якось відокремлюють оцей імперський період, і вони не усвідомлюють того, про що пише Мартін Шульце Весель. І, на мою думку, це ще одна важливість цієї книжки, власне, не тільки для нас, що так актуалізується український чинник, а її важливість для німецького суспільства, для усвідомлення і переосмислення, власне, і російської історії, і її імперського періоду. Якщо я помиляюся, що існує ця романтизація, то, певно, Мартін Шульце Весел мене виправить, а якщо вона дійсно існує, то я б була йому вдячна, якби він трошечки пояснив, які причини цієї такої романтизації в німецькому суспільстві російського, саме імперського минулого. Дякую.
Thank you, Polina, for your remarks, which can be also kind of a starting point for the discussion. But now I hand over the word to Frank Sysyn and ask him for a commentary. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Poles spontaneously reacted to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the arrival of refugees, took them into their houses, and looked at the struggle as their own. They understood something that statesmen, political scientists, and commentators in Europe and North America did not understand. And I think for those who want to understand the Polish reaction, they now have the perfect book to read, albeit in German. I would also like to say that while this book is specifically written, as the author has told us, for the German context, it has far greater relevance, and I would like to see both its English and Ukrainian and its Polish translations as soon as possible. It was mentioned that I speak from Canada, and I must say, looking at the book, I did think of Britain, for many Canadians, or some still, the mother country, and the inner empire of England. That is, the relation with Scotland and why British identity was possible, and the relationship of Ireland and why so many disasters also came out of the extension of that inner empire. Because in some ways, we are dealing with what becomes the empire to the west, the inner empire for Russia. Now, we have long developed a discussion in trying to understand Russian political thought, Russian identity, as to what degree it is imperial, as many of my colleagues insisted for a very long time, and to what degree it is national or Russian nationalist, and from when is that national factor inserted into it. And I think this book is a major contribution to that discussion, and is a book that I think is written at the proper time when historians and political scientists are rethinking some of their paradigms. And one of those paradigms, of course, was Russian imperial identity and how the turn towards empire was understood when it became quite fashionable in many circles at the end of the last and beginning of this century. But I would also say the book also deals with the issue of continuity, Tsarist, Soviet, and contemporary Russian. And then, in this sense, it is written, I think, at the proper time and distance. It could not have written as convincingly 20 or 25 years ago, when the future of Russia and which way Russia would go was still in question. We now have the evidence after these years, and they show the continuity from Tsarist Empire through the Soviet Union to what contemporary Russia is, whatever the differences in those political formations. I would also say what it also shows us is the crucial but differentiated role of Ukraine and Poland in these developments, and at times when these roles have switched, as they have in the current moment. I think, as my colleague Polina Barvinska has brought up, prominence of the Polish factor in the interwar period is something that I would like consideration of and like to have a bit more developed. But I think we can all turn to two major periods that this book brings out. And I'd like to pose a question to the author of whether he sees these as two mistakes. That is, the Russian imperial extension west that brought Poland, Lithuania's divisions. Was this a piece too big to chew? And here I'm taking my colleague Roman Sporluk's discussion of Stalin's annexation of Western Ukraine and the Baltic. and arguing that perhaps Stalin, in order to take the whole pie in that case, or almost the whole pie, made a major mistake, as we can now see from current developments. I think behind this book is always the question, did we all say, and do Germans say, empire good and nation bad, which my colleague Polina Barvinska has already brought up. Then just for a few questions, we all are centered in the periods we have studied, but I would like to deal a bit with the beginning in 1700. It seems axiomatically true. After all, this is when Russia is declared as an empire in this period in the Western sense. It is also the time when most historians have seen the end of the 17th century, at least the long 18th century, as above all the century of empires and absolutism, and have paid relatively little attention in the 18th century to those states which continued their republican identity. But of course, a state like Poland, however truncated at the end of the 18th century, was still able to show considerable life and development. What would we do with Polish culture today, partially as a reaction to the partitions, if it had not been for the Polish Enlightenment? So perhaps a little discussion of how that fits would be in. But my real interest is the Hetmanate of 1700 the proper time to begin this discussion for Ukrainian developments? And I think I would like to see a little discussion that goes back further into the 17th and maybe to the end of the 16th century, a time of tremendous cultural and political change in the Ukrainian territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And I would say a time when a concept of a pre-modern nation is really formed based on models of the Commonwealth, a model that has neither sovereign or Tsar nor state as its necessary components, but still reflects European humanism, the developments of Republican thought in Poland, Lithuania. And that was what made Ukraine quite different. It also made Ukrainians, I think, quite important in introducing the concept of nation into Russian political thought. And that is shown in the book in the time of empire. But I think that process was already well developed by the early 17th century, and that may be brought to bear. My colleague Serhii Plokhy has written, I think, very convincingly of this on the formation of identity. And in many ways, the Ukrainian introduction of nation, somehow associated with the Rus identity, then provided a very difficult concept for Muscovy to accept and to change, and in some ways became deformed by the imperial experiment. And then finally, on the concept of what this empire is, I think a little discussion might be worthwhile of the Russian Empire as the new Constantinople. It comes up not only in Catherine's age, but would reintroduce the concept of the sole Orthodox empire and continue more fully into this. It is, after all, a tradition which becomes already problematic between Russians and Ukrainians in the 17th century in what one would do with the Kiev Metropolitanate. And we see this very same issue emerging today in Ukraine. Was it illegitimate, the act of 1686? So that predates, in many ways, the empire as we have in this discussion. I think the issue of Bolshevism as Russian has now reemerged in a way that it has not before. I do agree that the 1920s were an attempt to deal with the national issue, but how much were they a reaction, not willingly embarked on, but had there not been the Ukrainian states, and this is shown in the book, of 1917 to 20, would really Russian Bolshevism have reacted as it did? And was it always, to a degree, a bad fit? And should we not look at it very differently in how it acted out on the Western periphery of the empire from those areas of Central Asia and Siberia. I think we have tried to put too much of this together. And then finally, this book is very important for showing us what Russia, denuded of its earlier ideologies, has tried to do in this age after its invasion of Ukraine. That is, on the one hand, declaring, as the book shows us, this internal unity of East Slavic peoples with the rather strange interpretations of history that Putin, not only Putin has put forward, but many Russian historians have followed along with. How much they have changed since the 1990s in their discussion of Ukrainian matters, and after a short positive period, reverted to what might be this identity of a unity of somehow a primordial unity of these East Slavic peoples. But on the other hand, how inadequate only a war against Ukraine is, to what degree it also has to become a war with a bigger concept in order to fill this imperial identity, that is a war with the West. I think those are dealt with well in this book. I'd like a little more discussion from our author. And of course, the converse has been how easy the Ukrainian national identity, which in some ways tried to find a place within the Russian imperial identity, but always was based on nation in some sense of whatever that word made, but also did not see very quickly a divergence from Europe, partially because of the geographic realities of a large number of Ukrainian speakers existing outside the Russian Empire, which made them somewhat similar to the Poles in always having the Poles beyond the border, and that comes to be very important, but also seeing its fate as tied with Europe, sometimes to the good and sometimes to the bad, and presently much to the good, if Europe will understand that. It is a wonderful book, and it does read really very well. So I congratulate the author on the book and for this contribution, both to the German reading public for rethinking many issues, but also for our understanding of empire and nation.
Thank you very much, Frank, for your remarks. So Martin, there's a lot of praise in the two commentaries by Polina and Frank, but there are also a few issues you might take up, or you would like to take up, or to comment, or critical remarks. And I would be very grateful if you can answer a bit comprehensive to the comments, so that we can take up a few questions then after your reply.
Oh, okay. Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Polina, Barvinska, and thank you, Frank Sysyn, for these very valuable comments. And I take up some of the questions. Polina, you mentioned that you elaborated on the historical tradition in Germany of historiography. And indeed, I think this has to be discussed, as it is astonishing that Ukraine did not play a major role for such a long time. And the first point you mentioned yourself is the historiography of the 19th century, which was state-oriented and defined by imperial interests. I mean, it was centered in Prussia. The main characteristic historians are Leopold von Ranke and Troisen. And of course, they were only interested in power politics and in political history in the broader sense. And therefore, Russia was part of their horizon and Ukraine was not. And there was one alternative in German historiography, which was located in Leipzig, that was Lamprecht, a concept of cultural history, which was not successful in the German tradition, unfortunately, one could say. And in the 20th century, when political history became less important, the history of society was very much focused on German history, maybe English history, but it was not even interested, for example, in the history of Sweden. Yeah, and therefore it was also not interested in Ukraine. And there's a second reason, I think, and this has to do with this Russian tradition, which you mentioned in Germany. Well, first of all, it's romanticism, as you mentioned it's an interest in Russian kitsch. But at the same time, it's looking at the Russian Empire through the lens of a Russian national perspective, I would say. And we were looking at Ukraine often through the lens of Russia. And this is the biggest problem, I would say, in the German tradition. Yeah. Frank Sysyn, thank you for the many comments. I just take up one of them, which seems to me especially important. That is the prehistory, which I did not touch, the 16th and 17th centuries, which are indeed important for the transnational exchange of concepts, or better to say, the transfer of concepts from Ukraine to Moscow. And there is, for example, the concept of a nation, as you mentioned it, but it's also the concept of a Tsar and of power relations. This all came from the West, from the Western periphery and from Ukraine especially. So there are many paradoxical, I would say, paradoxical phenomena which one should focus on. And at the same time, if one focuses on the origins of the imperial thought in Russia, one could go back to Ivan III and Ivan IV too. This is also a context in my book which could be broadened. So I had to decide when to start, and I would admit that there are contexts which are not so much highlighted in my book.
Thank you very much, Martin. So I think that the last point is important because it was not only Frank's question to you, so the starting point of around 700, but it's also in the chat, the question by Yevhen Zakharchenko, who points to the Russian or Moscow-Livonian wars and Russian-Lithuanian relations in the 16th century. So, but I think that you have replied to this general question of the starting point for such an analysis.
Maybe I should explain it once more. I mean, it's a decision to say that there's a set of features that begin at the beginning of the 18th century and that are present today. And these features are, as I mentioned, this politics of hegemony, the special German-Russian relations, and the imperial infrastructures. And I would say this set is really something specific that begins at the beginning of the 18th century, but that does not mean that a single feature did not begin earlier. I mean, the imperial thought began earlier, and of course one could highlight the intellectual development of Ukraine more broadly and more profound if one goes back to the 16th and 17th century.
Yes, thank you. And there's a question by Katerina Kopchenko. Should I read it out, Martin, or do you see the question?
No, you should read it. I do not see it.
Yes, she's asking, don't you think that the overcoming of imperial legacy you mentioned should also take place in the Western perspective, inclusive academia of interpreting Eastern Europe, both in factological and methodological cases?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big task of our generation, I would say. I mean, even the concept of Eastern Europe is very questionable. I mean, Ukraine is part of the Mediterranean world in a certain sense, and one should not fix it to a certain concept of space, and to rethink the concept of spaces is really essential. I agree with that.
So to have a flexible understanding of this. I might have one question to you as well. So there is, of course, this dominant tradition of relations between Germany and Russia and this imperial compliance, but there were also always other traditions in Germany as well. So in the late 19th century, the socialist workers' movement was rather critical towards Russia. Then we have World War I and the time period after World War I, when we have Brest-Litovsk. And so on. How do you bring this in? It is just contingency, or is there more than contingency?
No, I would argue that Germany is a state between the East and the West, and there was always, I mean, in the 19th century, there was always a party which was against Russia and was in favor of the West. I mean, this internal conflict in Germany is so characteristic for all the 19th century that the questions of the left and the right are always combined with political spaces. For example, Theodor Fontane, a great German novelist from Prussia, by the way, he spent years in England as a journalist, and he was really a convinced Westerner, writing at the same time novels about Prussia, which are read still today with nostalgic lens. And I mean, this is characteristic for the present time as well. I mean, we have politicians who are very clear-minded, I would say, and have made their decision in favor of the West, not only in 2022, but already long before. Politicians from the Green Party, but also politicians from the Conservative Party, if they are experts in foreign policy, like Norbert Röttgen or Kiesewetter. At the same time, there is the preparation of a new party in Germany now by Sarah Wagenknecht. It's a leftist party with a lot of conservative features. And I think the most important point in this program, which is in the making now, the most important program is the New Start in relations with Russia. And this party can get about 10% in the elections. So the situation is fluid, I would say.
So if Polina and Frank have no questions at the moment anymore, and I don't see a question in the chat, then I have a further question to you, and I would really get a better understanding of your understanding of the place of German Ostpolitik in your larger picture. So, but because it was much disputed in 2022 and until now, and you are presenting, I think, a rather differentiated picture of German Ostpolitik, and many in Germany, many colleagues and many political scientists, they make a difference between the 1970s and the 1980s, and the German policy towards Poland and German policy towards Soviet Union. And can you a little bit elaborate on this very hotly disputed topic, please?
Yeah. Well, my view on this is that the beginning of Ostpolitik by Willy Brandt was really a new start. One could discuss it like I discussed Alexander I and Gorchakov. It was something unexpected in the German tradition. And the unexpected moment is not that there was new policy towards Moscow, but that it was combined with a new policy towards Warsaw. I mean, the visit of Brandt in Warsaw in 1970 was really a miracle, I would say, in the German tradition. But this was given up by the successors, and the German Ostpolitik turned into a business to improve the German-German relations between East and West. And for this purpose, the connections to Moscow were important, but not the connections to Warsaw and Prague and Kiev, for example. Kiev did not play a role in the German Ostpolitik at all, and was neglected. Even a visit was not paid to Barvinska, for example. It's difficult to say whether this was possible at that time, but as far as I know, it wasn't even tried.
Thank you. There's one question by Vasil Sinevich. Jakie u pana Martina Schulze Wessela idei dla podalszych doświadczeń problemy proklatja imperii? So.
Well, maybe it's too early for this question for me. I've just finished it, and I'm still a little bit exhausted. But of course, it's 350 pages for 300 years, and so there is a lot of space for deepening the questions which are brought up. And of course, there's much to do, I would say. I mean, one project which interests me now is a project between two universities, between the Catholic University of Lviv and the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, my university. And we are building up a center in Lviv about the mass crimes of the 20th centuries in the 1930s and 1940s, and try to see in one context the Holodomor, the German mass crimes during the occupation, the Holocaust, of course, forced labor, and so on. And there's much empirical work to do. It is important to see the crimes in the connection with the memory of the crimes, and that is what we want to do in the next years.
Thank you. And there's one question by Frank, if I understand.
Yes.
Correctly.
Yes, it's a question. Yesterday at the 18th Century Conference, someone from Oxford said that a year ago, Oxford was open to doing something Ukrainian. By this year, they didn't do anything, and it doesn't look like it's moving. And one way, I wonder to what degree, as you know the field, and particularly specialists in Russian history in Germany, to what degree do you see a shift and an openness both to your ideas in this book, as well as to a reconsideration of some issues related to Ukrainian and Polish history, for that matter? Is there really a Zeitenwende among academic at this time?
Yeah. Well, I had some discussions with colleagues or with one colleague, and in this discussion, I hadn't been. I was not sure that the ideas were understood of a book, but I would say I'm still waiting for reviews of this book. This needs some time. There was a very positive and review written by a colleague from Frankfurt Oder, by Andriy Portnov. And let's see how the discussion develops. I mean, if you think about the institutional questions, we have this center in Frankfurt Oder now about Ukrainian studies. I do not know how well it is financed. And the main question is, or besides this important center, another important question is how chairs are define their tasks in research, and I'm quite optimistic in this sense, because many of the younger people are really interested in Ukraine. So I'm optimistic in the long run, I would say.
Thank you very much, Martin. There are still questions coming up in the chat, but I think we should come to a close, and maybe you can answer briefly in the chat to the last questions which are coming in. But I'm seeing that we are coming to 7:30, and I think we should come to an end by now. I would very much like to thank you, Martin, for participating in this webinar and introducing your book to the audience. And I'm very grateful to the two discussions, to Polina Barvinska and to Frank Sysyn for their remarks on the book and for the entire discussion. I would like to end just with pointing to a next webinar, which we will organize in December. But the topic will be transitional justice, and we will inform you by the social media. And please take a look at the homepage of the German-Ukrainian Historical Commission, of Ukraina Moderna, of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, on the exact date and on the participants. And with this, I would like to close our webinar. Thank you very much, and I wish you a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido, and thank you to Frank and Polina and to all participants for the attention.